Thank you everyone who has continued to support the channel by following and subscribing. And of course, if this is your first time, I hope you enjoy this episode and you are also willing to subscribe to the channel. Now, you probably remember this episode in the past of Owlman. Yeah, I did a cape replacement, and now it's time to do it again. Primarily because it's now a commission piece that they requested a specific cape. Now, this is the one that I worked up earlier. It's okay. In the end, it's not good enough. So I decided to redo not only my own figure, but the commission piece, give it a totally new design. Let's see what I came up with. As mentioned earlier, this is a commission piece, and the client sent in the material he wants to be used on this particular cape. Now you can get this at Joann's Fabrics, which is where he got his sample, and of course I went there to see other materials that are going to be needed here. To be very upfront with you, the first part of this video is entirely a mistake, but you have to see the mistake to see where to make the corrections. Now inside the cape, I wanted to have a liner. So I chose this material. This is one that I purchased on my own. This is my original cape, and as you can tell, there's a lot of stitching, there's a lot of sewing, and at the time, I thought that this was great. Well, I decided to redo the design and cut it in the same way that I cut the other capes. So it's a lot bigger from what you can tell here, and it's a lot straighter, and the edges aren't as jagged. Now, here's the situation. I needed to cut a pattern so I can have a correct and clean design on those, well, I guess they're feathers. They're not scallops. So what I did is I took an X-Acto knife, I used some styrene to create a pattern, and I had to score it to be able to cut it. Now I'm going to give you another trick here, is soap. Why soap? What does soap have to do with sewing or anything of this industry? Well, if you take a piece of soap, you can now use it as a marker or a marking tool or a scribe, especially on dark colors like this. Now they do have an actual water or washable crayon, but it doesn't work as good as the soap. And the soap is very inexpensive. It's, well, you can say it's almost free because you only need a tiny little piece of it, and it goes a long way. So this is my design that I cut out of my template. So I can use either one. I can use the solid surface or the empty surface, and I can scribe exactly where I want my lines, and they're all going to be in the same angle. Now you only want to do one side of it. I ended up trying to do both sides, and I found that it was just easier to scribe on one side, fold it in half, and then make my cuts. But now you can see that it's so much easier to have a pattern that is easier to follow. And now if you do mess up, you can just take a wet cloth and wipe away the soap, and you won't have a mark on the actual cloth. So you don't want to use a marker, you don't want to use a pen, you want to use soap because it's removable and it's less expensive. So I ended up liking my scribing or my markings on the right hand side of the cape as opposed to the left. So I decided to then fold it in half, and it was easier actually to leave it unfolded and cut the actual material on the right hand side first, simply because I just didn't like the lines on the left. Now, as you can tell, I'm cutting a 1/4 inch away from the actual line that I scribed. And my thought at the time was, oh, I want to fold in the edge so I have a clean seam. And unfortunately, it just didn't work out because the material is so thick, and then the liner that I put on the other side is a pleather. It's also thick. So the two combined made it just a really bad looking edge. But I went ahead and did this because I wanted to see, well, how bad does it look? End result was just not good. And at this point, what I had to do was glue the material together. Sewing it wasn't going to work for me because it's just so tiny of a margin or a end that to glue together and then sew. This is my actual result. I put the wires in there just to see where my problems were going to occur. I liked what the wire's doing. I don't like the way the cape looks. This prototype needs a lot of corrections. I put in the seam or spleen or spline for each one of those feathers, and you can actually see it in the reflection of the light. It deters from the material, the actual design. So I had to start over. So let me show you how I glued down this piece. And I did speed up the camera because it takes forever. And I used 2 pieces of styrene, the same one that I cut as a template and the extra that I had. One underneath to protect the mat from any residue of glue, and then the top just to keep the material exactly where I needed it instead of folding over the entire piece. This is the result. Okay, so now we're back to the beginning. This is now the second cape. I've recut it. The edges look so much cleaner, so much nicer. It's all one thickness, so it's going to be much easier to work with. Now, I did cut those edges with the rotary tool instead of the scissors, and it works so much better. And yes, I followed all of my soap lines. Now, on the inside, I did change the liner. I used a thinner piece of cloth, and it still has a texture like it's pleather, but it's a lot thinner and it tapes down easier with that iron-on tape. Now this is the first one that I totally ruined. And on this one, I decided to put in the wires, as I mentioned, and I put in those splines for the wires. You can see them here. And I ended up using also a silver thread just to play with, and I love what that silver thread does. This is the inside, and as you can tell, I had a lot of problems with that bobbin. It just kept making a bird's nest all over the place. It's just really, really not acceptable. And in the end, the inside liner is just ultimately too distracting. So I didn't like it, and it's just way too thick. It's too heavy for the figure to hold up. And when you have 3 layers, it gets incredibly heavy. And at the edge just wasn't clean. Now the sewing does help. It does hold it together, but it still doesn't look neat and tidy. And we want it to look nice and neat once it's all finished. Now I cut that hole at the top to add the wires, and I'll be doing the same on the second cape. This is the second layer that goes now on our first cape. I also cut a template out of styrene. The reason I'm using the styrene is because it's obviously much more durable than paper, and now I can repeat the process if I ever get a request for a recreation of this same cape, and then watch my own video and do the process. Now we're going to place that on top of this. This is what it's going to look like, and as you can tell, it's really hard to tell them apart because they're obviously both the same color. So now we've got to find a way to make them stand out. Now it's the same material on the inside I'm going to glue down, draw in my lines as you see here with my soap. I'm going to take this stand and mark a circle around the top with the soap. I don't want to go beyond this line with any sewing or anything else. I want to keep the sewing underneath that line. I'm going to emphasize my divisions between the feathers. In this case, they're feathers. If it was a Batman cape, it would be scallops. That way I can sew that silver thread in between to make a separation of each one of those pieces. Originally, in my first video, I cut individual pieces. It was just a nightmare to put it back together. So now when you lay it on top, you'll be able to differentiate the 2 pieces, 2 layers. And these will also have their own wires. Now it's still difficult to tell it apart. What we need to do is sew with that silver thread to really make it stand out. This is what it looks like. You want to choose the small zigzag, close it together, close the distance together, close the width to make it a tight knit, and actually a tight stitch. It's going to look like embroidery. Let me have you take a look at how slow this process was. Now let's take a look at the cape the way it looks now. Once you have finished those silver splines, it should look like this. The inside is the actual liner that you're looking at here. Now, if you look at the cape in the center, I'm going to put in a wire, but I didn't take that pocket or second spline all the way to the edge. It's only halfway, because I don't want it to detract from the design. I only want it to hold a wire. And by doing it halfway, it's going to be hidden by the second layer. Now Mezco does this with their wires. They actually fold the wire in half and they put it into pockets into each one of those scallops. And that still provides enough anchorage or support for that wire to move independently, not twist around or flop around. So I'm going to add 3 large wires, obviously folded in half, so that it'll encompass a total of 6 of these feathers. I am going to do the same for the small second layer. Each one of these now is a small pocket. I don't need to put in a channel in between. It's so small that the actual pocket will hold the wire in place just fine. And I won't have to anchor anything into the body using this method on these 2 layers. Now in the first layer, we still have to anchor the edges to the outside of the neck at the edge so that it holds that wire, because that one is going to be cut. It's not going to be a continuous piece. Here, I'll have 3 pieces on the inside, so a total of 6 pockets are going to have a wire, and that's going to give this part of the cape its own diverse posing so that it looks that much more dynamic. Now the key question is, well, how do I install it? And that's always important. So I'm going to show you what I do on this particular one that I designed. Now I've seen some videos where they show you how to do their own cape installation, and I did that on the first one. I didn't like it because it was that much more complicated to actually hold the cape down. But if you cut the cape at the back, you will have a key that fits into that slot. Now, at the side, you want to drill into the neck. You want to keep that key. You want to take a wire and test out that hole that you drilled out. You want to make sure it's clean so that when you put the wire in there, you're not having to fight, having to go through some debris that's an obstacle inside that hole that you drilled out. You don't want to cut that key. I'm going to show you why in just a moment. Now, I've already added the wires to my cape. I am now going to add a small drop of this gel Loctite super glue. 1 wire at a time only. Start on the right or left, pick one. I'm going to start on the right. I'm now going to take my needle nose pliers to keep my hands away from the glue, push up the cowl in the back or the back of the cape, and I'm going to place it inside the hole that I drilled. I want it to stay there until it's fully dry. So that means I can't pose the cape. While that is in process of drying, you can either hold it down or tape it down, then apply glue to the second wire. Again, only a small drop on the wire, not on the surface, because once it's on the wire, it will actually glide in with that glue and it will adhere to the plastic on the inside. If you place it on the outside of the surface of the actual the hole where you're going to be working with, it's not going to take in enough glue. Now, once you've placed both wires in, let it rest, let it actually cure long enough for you to be able to handle it while you attach the other cape or the second layer. In the meantime, I'm going to pop this leg back on and get it situated again. Now, the second layer is important to hide the other seams that we have in the back. And as you can tell, I did cut out a hole for the key. Now, I used my scissors, so I just carefully measured out how wide, how tall, and that key is going to hold this top layer or second layer. If you don't do this, you'll have to glue it down, and it's going to be that much more difficult to hold this down because you'll need more glue to do so. With this, you just need a very little amount of glue above the key to hold the material, and then inside the slot where the key goes. Once you place it in there, guess what? You have a really strong hold on that particular, well, on both capes, because that second cape or layer is going to be glued underneath to the first layer, which is also glued in with the wires, and now you've got a double support. Now, if you want to push this in because you are unable to push it in with your fingers, then use a flat screwdriver and move it into position. Once it's there, it's gonna stay. Now, I'm using the fabric tack glue. It dries slower, so it's going to take a good 4 hours to fully cure. I don't use a super glue here because once it's down, and you're not going to be able to adjust it. Now take a look at the second layer. Totally independent. Yes, there's a third layer, and all of them together look like this. The small third layer on top, that's just glued around the edge and tucked in around the feathers at the shoulders and glued in. That's it. But now you have the before and after, my mistake on the left from my first video and my corrected process or finished process on the right. In the comments below, let me know your thoughts of the one on the left and the current one on the right. Thank you once again, everybody, for enduring till the end of this video. If this is your first time, I hope that you enjoyed this episode and you continue to return. If you are a returning subscriber, I'm glad you're here. I hope that you learned something today and that you actually like this episode. Now, I understand that some of you may be asking, well, how can I obtain a copy of this particular cape for myself? And yes, you can. All of those details are in the description below. Make sure you read those and contact me through email to make arrangements to obtain your own copy. Keep in mind that these are all handmade to order and there'll be a slight variance from one to the other. So no two capes are going to be exactly alike. And I'm only going to limit this to a very small batch because they're incredibly difficult to make, very time consuming. They're entertaining, but they take a while from other projects. In the meantime, let me know your comments and thoughts about the cape, the process, the actual character, if you, whatever is on your mind about this particular episode. But in the meantime, keep customizing those figures. We'll see you here next time.